Hi everyone, it's V from Motherhood with Me, and welcome to my first ever story, my birth story. So I'm excited to share this story, but also really nervous because obviously it's really personal. And in fact, when I first had Luca, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. And I actually asked my partner Johnny not to tell anyone about the birth. I just felt like it was too personal and sort of embarrassed, and I just didn't want to share it. However, I really want to connect with other mums and share my story, so that, like, knowing what I know now about postnatal recovery and about birth, I just feel really passionately about letting people know all of these things that are really common with birth and with postnatal recovery that I didn't know about before, despite attending loads of antenatal classes, reading like every book I could get my hands on, Googling everything. There were still so many things that I didn't know. So I'm trying to take off my embarrassed hat and be really open and honest and share my story, so that we can start having these conversations, and so that it's not a taboo subject anymore. I just want to say as well that I'm really not here to scare anyone. I'm not trying to shock or sensationalise at all. This is just a really honest account about what happened during my birth. I also didn't have a crazy sort of birth that was beyond normal. The birth that I had was what loads of people experience, but I still found it traumatic because I still felt like I wasn't actually sort of told enough about what to expect during giving birth. So going through it at the time, it was quite traumatic. I will admit that I am definitely someone who over prepares for everything. So leading up to giving birth, I'd watched every single One Born Every Minute that was available, all of Emma Willis delivering babies, everything like that. And then giving birth, I realised how edited those programs are. They just don't show the realities of how long labour can be, of like how long pushing can be, of the end before the placenta's delivered. There's no stitching, there's none of that. So that is something that really fueled me wanting to share this as well. So I'm going to get started now on my actual birth story. I feel like I've waffled on enough. I will do a separate video about writing a birth plan, and advocating sort of for your rights, because I actually asked for an out of guidelines birth, so that's something I'll do a separate video on. But just for a bit of context, I really wanted to give birth in our local birthing centre, which was a midwife-led unit. So it was sort of more focused on a home birth type experience, but in a midwife unit. However, it was attached to the labour ward, as in it was one floor down in the hospital from the labour ward. So I felt very safe in that. You may or may not know that generally induction starts to be recommended from 41 weeks. So 40 weeks is your due date, and then 41 weeks is your due date, obviously plus 7 days. So the first thing I was asked at my sort of 40-week appointment was I happy to be induced at 41 weeks. I really wanted to avoid any sort of interference. I really wanted to go into spontaneous labour. I'd read a lot about, everything to do with induction. I'd read about, they do, I feel, like to use statistics to kind of try and persuade you. And what I would recommend is reading up on those statistics. For example, I was told that after 41 weeks, your risk of stillbirth goes up by 50%. When I delved into that and read the official sort of NHS report around that, it went from 1 in 1,000 to 2 in 1,000. So technically, yes, it is a 50% increase. Yes, it does double. But to me, from 1 to 2 wasn't justifiable enough reason for me to agree to induction bang on 41 weeks. And that is because, induction comes with its own risks. And induction can lead to a lot longer labour. I kind of worried that if the baby it wasn't ready to come, it could lead to more interference. I'd also had a very uncomplicated pregnancy in terms of, I'd not had gestational diabetes, I'd never had reduced fetal movements, I'd not had any bleeding, not had any high blood pressure, I'd had no treatments. I had had an unpleasant pregnancy in terms of, hyperemesis, which is excessive sickness, nothing that was dangerous to me or the baby. You also get offered a sweep by the midwife. Your community midwife can do it, and that is where they sort of use their fingers to sweep your membranes and try to release, I think it's hormones that sort of start off labour. I also didn't want that. It just didn't sound pleasant. And from what I'd read, it really was very hit and miss as to whether it started off labour as well. And again, I didn't feel like I wanted to put myself through that, or sort of it can bring a bit of an increased risk of infection and things like that. I just didn't feel like it was necessary at 40 weeks. It's very common to go over your due date, so I didn't feel like there was any pressure there to try and bring labour on at that point. So I did agree to be induced at 41 plus 6 days, so basically 1 day before 42 weeks. So, yes, I pushed back to a point, but I wasn't going to, just let it go on forever. So I did agree to induction, had induction booked in at 41 plus 6 days, which is the day Luca was actually born, but not the day that I went into labour. So I went into labour at 41 plus 3 days. So I went into labour on a Tuesday afternoon, and we had been going for walks every day, which was obviously uncomfortable at that point, but had been fine. I'd been managing to do about a half an hour walk, and on the Tuesday we went out. We'd got, I think, less than 5 minutes away, I'd say. And I just got this feeling like a bowling ball had just dropped into my pelvis. Oh my God, I didn't think I could even walk, and just had to take a few steps at a time to get home 5 minutes away. And from that point on, my contractions started. So I used my birthing ball, which I'd had throughout pregnancy, and I got a TENS machine that I'd hired, and I would recommend that for early labour. It does help with the contractions, and started to time the contractions as well. According to sort of hospital guidance in terms of going in, you should be getting 3 in 10 minutes, and there's a certain length which I can't remember off the top of my head now. I think it's around lasting 40 seconds. So from the get-go I was having about 2 in 10 minutes, so very frequent, but not frequent enough to be in what is considered active labour. So basically for the rest of the day I was having contractions, I was on my ball using the TENS machine, timing them. That just sort of consumed all the time, because if you think 2 in 10 minutes, and they were lasting about over a minute at a time, there wasn't much of a break between them. And contractions, I'll try and describe how it felt to me. A lot of people describe them as waves, and I'd agree with that. So it's sort of like a feeling that builds and builds and builds, peaks, and then eases off, and then there's nothing for a few minutes. So obviously that's sort of how you cope. You cope because you get a break between them, at least at this point in early labour. So it's sort of like a cramp, but it's not like, to be honest, a pain I've ever had before. It's quite unique. So I had them for all of Tuesday. Tried to have a bit to eat, tried to go to bed, really struggled to sleep, because obviously I couldn't sleep through the contractions, and they were coming so regularly I couldn't get to sleep in between them. We did end up phoning the hospital, the labour line, at the early hours of the morning, I think maybe around 1 a.m. But I did have a COVID test booked for 9 a.m. on the Wednesday morning, because to be induced on the Friday you had to have a COVID test 48 hours before. So I sort of told them the situation. They said what I thought they were going to say, which was, I wasn't having contractions, like 3 in 10 minutes, so not to go in yet, and to wait until sort of 9 a.m, go in for my COVID test. And I thought, right, well, I'll ask then for an assessment, see where I'm at. So at 9 a.m, we went in. My COVID test was in the birthing centre, which is where I wanted to give birth. So we went in, and I asked for an assessment at the same time. So I had my COVID test, which wasn't as bad as I was expecting. I was really, really nervous about the COVID test. Yeah, it's not pleasant, but it's over so fast. Your eyes water a little bit, you might gag a little bit. and then it's over, and it's honestly nowhere near as bad as I expected. So don't panic if you have one of those booked. And then I asked for an assessment. So the midwife asked if I'd like a sweep at that point. And I ended up agreeing because I think once I was in labour, once you're in that pain, then you are a bit more keen to speed things up if you can. So she did an assessment and said I was at 2 centimetres, did the sweep. Again, I was so nervous about the sweep because I'd heard like horror stories of people saying they were agony. Honestly, barely felt it. It was not painful. So again, if you are wanting to have a sweep or nervous, my personal experience, it was not painful. It's nothing to worry about. I'm just going to quickly say, obviously everything in this video is my experience. Totally appreciate that everyone has a different experience. So people will have had painful sweeps. It'll depend on who does it as well. But if I have found something not as bad as I expected, I want to share that because I want to reassure people that it doesn't have to be painful if mine wasn't. After that, I went home. The sweep did cause a bit of light bleeding, which is very common. So again, don't panic if you experience that. And contractions just continued for the rest of the day. So this was Wednesday. They actually got a bit more irregular. So sometimes it would be 4 minutes between them, sometimes it would be 7. But there was just a bit of a variance there. I think I had a bit of pizza early evening on the Wednesday. Tried to go to bed, and then they got quite intense. And I was sort of doubled up in bed. There was no way I was going to sleep. Really sort of painful at this point. So I got up, woke Johnny up, said like, this is getting quite bad. I went downstairs and I sort of said I wanted to phone the labour line, but I started to shake, like just couldn't control it. I was sick, so I really sort of felt a change. So Johnny phoned the labour line, told them what was happening. They spoke to me. I think they go off a lot of what you sort of sound like as well. And obviously at this point I didn't sound great. So they told me to go in for another assessment. So we went in. So this was after midnight. I definitely remember 2 a.m. either being the time I sort of was admitted. So it was somewhere between midnight and 2 that we headed in. And actually, I think like this time I knew it was quite likely that like labour was progressing. And if you've done any reading around the sort of science of labour, you'll know that adrenaline actually can kick in and stop contractions. And it all goes back to sort of caveman times when we'd have to flee like beasts that wanted to eat us. Like our contractions would stop so that we could get to safety, and that is still in us. So I think my adrenaline kicked in because I was scared because we were going into hospital, and my contractions actually stopped. And I remember thinking, they're going to think I'm a liar because like I've told them on the phone I'm having regular contractions and they're really bad, and then like they've stopped. We got to the birth centre, which is where they do the assessment. It was a different midwife obviously to who I'd seen that morning. She did another assessment and another sweep. She said I was at 3 centimetres. So if you think like a whole day of contractions has gone by and I'd only gone 1 centimetre further, that second sweep caused a lot of bleeding. So she said she wanted to send me up to the delivery suite, which is sort of where all the doctors are. So up we went. I got put on the monitor where they put sort of the bands around your stomach and they can hear the baby's heartbeat. I was on there for about 40 minutes at least. Everything was fine, there wasn't any concerns, but a doctor came in to talk to me. They sort of had this tendency to ask you what you wanted, but I kind of felt like they already knew what they were going to say and what they were going to do, so it kind of felt a bit pointless being asked that, and that irritated me. But anyways, I was asked what I wanted, and I said, at this point, I don't really want to go home to like come back in. I think now I'm here. Like I was feeling really nervous, and I just sort of, I said I'd like to stay. I'd like to go to the birth centre because that was where it had been agreed that I could give birth if all went well. The doctor said, well, we wouldn't send you home when you're experiencing bleeding because we don't know where it's coming from. And then she said, we wouldn't allow you to go to the birth centre with bleeding. So that really upset me because I'd spent my whole pregnancy advocating for a birth centre birth, and to be told like right at the start of my labour when I was being admitted that I couldn't even start off there was really difficult to take. I was really upset that I wasn't allowed to at least go down to the birth centre to begin with, especially when, as I say, there had been no concerns. And yeah, I appreciate there was some bleeding, but I felt very strongly that it was just the sweep that had done that. Anyways, I was told that I had to be admitted to the delivery suite, so that is what happened. The doctor also said at this point that I could have my waters broken if I wanted. Again, I sort of asked a lot of questions about that. Was there any risks, any downsides to having that done? And decided that, yeah, I was going to do that to sort of progress labour. This was in the height of summer, by the way, when we were having like virtual heat wave, I think, and it was so hot. So I asked if I could actually have a shower first. So we went to the delivery room, which had an ensuite with a shower, and I actually had a shower. And I remember it was quite funny because I had like this really nice sort of spa shower foam, which I used, and I was like having contractions in the shower because they started coming thick and fast again. I think like once I was admitted and like the adrenaline went and everything kicked like off again. So I was having to pause for each contraction. I had this shower and I remember just like feeling quite luxurious, which was strange considering I was in labour in hospital. That was the last luxurious moment I had, I have to say. Put like an oversized t-shirt on and went out. I was told that with the fact that I've been admitted with bleeding, they wanted to do continuous monitoring. So that's where you have the bands on you all the time so they can hear the baby's heartbeat all the time, which sort of restricts movement, which again, I'd wanted to be very active because everything you read says that it's better to move around and not be static in labour. Had my waters broken. So for anyone worried about this, again, completely painless for me. Barely felt it. It's just like a long stick with a sort of hook on the end. I didn't feel it. There wasn't any like Titanic gush of water or anything like that either. It was all very quick, very painless, very sort of professionally cleaned up. If you know, I don't know, I never saw the waters. And I was told at that point that I was at 4 centimetres, so I was sort of in official established labour. By the way, something which I hadn't ever seen before was the bed setup. So generally you see people lying down in bed in labour. I was never laid down because the bed sort of dropped. You would sit and then the end dropped, so it was like a chair, like a giant throne basically. And that is, whenever I was on the bed, that is pretty much the position that I was in. That was something I'd never seen before on One Born Every Minute or anything like that. So at this point, I also learned that they assess you every 4 hours. So again, I didn't know how it worked, but I didn't realise there was like such a set schedule. So I had my waters broken and I was assessed at 4 centimetres, and then it was going to be 4 hours before I was assessed again. I got on the birthing ball. I was still on the monitor, but I managed to get on a birthing ball and sit and sort of bounce on that. And I put my TENS machine on, which helped. And like everything was quite fine. It was quite calm. We chatted with the midwives. I had two, so I had a main midwife and a student midwife with her, and we were just talking. And contractions were coming. I would have to pause, but they were manageable. I didn't touch gas and air, by the way. I didn't really want to be like out of it, like high, which is what I thought it would do. So I was managing okay, and then all of a sudden it just seemed to change, and there was sort of this hot pain in my lower back. But I remember sort of getting off the ball and lying down on the bed, and the student midwife went and came back with a hot, like a heat pack, and put it on my back, which was sort of nice but nowhere near enough to deal with this sort of new level of pain. And I remember the main midwife came and she sort of said, we've offered you the gas and air several times now, like why don't you give it a go? And I took the gas and air and took a breath of it at the same time as saying, I want an epidural, I need an epidural. So that's how quickly things changed. I went from no pain relief to my first breath of gas and air and just saying, I need the epidural now. So yeah, I mean, honestly, I did become a bit of a mad woman at this point. Like I'd watched One Every Minute and seen women screaming and saying I can't do it, and I thought, like honestly, I thought I'm not going to be that person. It doesn't matter what kind of person you are, I don't think. at this point in labour, like, it just takes over you. So I was saying a lot of dramatic things to Johnny. I had Johnny by the scruff of his top. So I was begging for the epidural. I was taking the gas and air constantly. By the way, the gas and air takes a few seconds to kick in, so you need to start breathing it in before the contraction for it to sort of help with the contraction. It does make you very high, or it made me very high anyways. Again, everyone's experience will be different. So when I was on it, even my own voice sounded different. It was weird. It was like a proper trip. I have to say, they were really fast at getting me the epidural. I think it was like the anaesthetist was in there within about 20 minutes setting up, I think. And this is from me going from like 0 to 100 of asking for the epidural as well. So there's like no warning. At this point as well, my midwives changed. So I got 2 new midwives, again, a sort of main midwife and a student. I did not register them at all because I was completely out of it, just begging for the epidural, begging for the epidural. So the anaesthetist came in, sort of introduced himself. I do remember he was called Paddy. So I remember Paddy. And the anaesthetist came in and I think talked through the risks. I think I was asked to sign a form. I just remember saying, yes, like, I don't care, paralysis, death, whatever, I need the epidural. And so they sit you up. Johnny was kind of away from me at this point because there's so many people around. My midwife was putting I think they're called a catheter or a cannula, but basically a tube that goes in here that they then put IV fluids in. So she was doing that while the anaesthetist was preparing my back. And there was also, they gave me a pillow to cuddle, and there was a man sort of standing bracing me, and he was really friendly and I really liked him as well. So he was sort of, I guess, the anaesthetist's assistant because he was only there for this part. And I had the midwife putting that in my arm and sort of just felt a hot, like, warm feeling on my hand, and I looked down and there was just blood everywhere and blood on the floor. And I looked at it and I was still taking the gas and air. I was still very high. I looked at it and I looked at Johnny and went, I think I'm dying. And the midwife went, no, you're not dying, no. But I could tell, like, I was thinking, I'm high, but I'm not high enough to tell that you're not panicking a little bit. Anyways, she got all that sorted, and I later learned that there was like a cap missing. So when the needle went into my vein, the blood just came out. It was fine. I was fine. I wasn't dying. But yeah, that was kind of like a funny moment afterwards. As the midwife said to me, oh, you didn't seem too concerned that you were dying. My reply was, it would be a relief if I was dying. Like, in the midst of labour, talking crazy things. So the anaesthetist sprayed my back with like the, I think, numbing or whatever it was, but it was like really cool and it was actually really nice. I did not feel the epidural needle. Didn't feel a thing, honestly. I don't know if that's because of the gas and air, because of my state of mind or what. I think if I was going in like I am now, like completely just normal, not in pain, sober, like, I assume I would feel the needle, but I didn't. Felt nothing until, like, obviously the medicine went in, and then I felt it going in, which was strange. This fluid going sort of into my back and down my legs, which was strange, but it honestly was just instant relief. And then everything changed again. I became happy and jolly and got to know my new midwives. It was crazy how quickly the epidural changed things. Even Johnny said he could not believe how quickly, like, the epidural changed how I was, because we'd had so many conversations about how I didn't want to have an epidural, and it made such a difference. I'd 100% recommend it. I was never trying to be a martyr, by the way. Say, you know, I did that without pain relief, because I don't believe in that. You know, you wouldn't go for a root canal without getting your tooth numbed. Yeah, it wasn't about that at all. It was purely actually me being a wimp and being scared of what the epidural could do. But once I was in that pain, that all went out the window. And at this point, I'm glad I was on the delivery suite, because if I'd been in the birthing centre, the epidural wasn't an option there. I would have had to have been transferred and it would have taken longer. So again, in hindsight, like, I'm happy to admit that I was pleased to be on the delivery suite. Straight after the epidural had been done, I was checked again, and at that point I was 7 centimetres. So then it all sort of made sense why things had changed so dramatically so quickly, because 7 centimetres is transition, and that's when they do talk about women getting very agitated, to put it mildly. That explained why I'd sort of gone from 0 to 100 as well. But then, as I say, I was quite happy. They also do this thing that I didn't know about, which is an in-out catheter. So instead of putting a catheter in, which is like for your wee, they do an in-out one. So they just put it in, make you wee, and then take it out again, which is really weird. I didn't like it, to be honest. I think it was more of a squeamish thing. I couldn't feel it because of obviously the epidural. But yeah, it was just weird. Like, I didn't like the sound of it. But that's what they do, and it's called bladder care. So every 4 hours when they check you, they also do bladder care. So another 4 hours went by and everything was fine. And then I was checked again and I was only at 8 centimetres. So exactly what I'd always worried about with having an epidural was the slowing down of labour, and I have to say this did happen to me. So that wasn't great. So the midwife went to talk to a doctor, a different doctor to the one who'd admitted me, and he came in to say that he recommended having a syntocin drip. So actually I had 2 of the 3 parts of induction, even though I went into labour naturally. So induction is like sort of a gel or a pessary that starts things off. Obviously I didn't have that because I went into natural labour. The next part is having your waters broken, and then the third part is the syntocin drip, and that's a synthetic version of oxytocin, which is the hormone that sort of makes labour progress. So I had a long discussion with him about that because, again, I'd read about the risks. I was worried that it could cause the baby distress, because I'd read that sort of the syntocin could often make baby's heart rate drop, they could get distressed and things. And he told me that, you know, it was unlikely because everything had been fine. If that did happen, they could actually turn it off really quickly and things. So I mean, we did have quite a lengthy discussion, and I have to say I never felt like pressured to make a quick decision. I guess because I was never in distress and the baby was never in distress throughout my labour. I talked about it with Johnny, I talked about it with the doctor some more, and I agreed to the syntocin drip. So I just went in the IV that was already in my hand. And by the way, epidurals have a boost button as well, so it stops you overdosing, and you can only do it every so often. I can't remember how often, but I think it was as little as 15 minutes. You could press a boost button, and I didn't use it that often, but I started to use it after the syntocin drip, because things definitely sped up again, and I started to get a feeling of pressure. And this is something I didn't know. So the epidural takes away pain, but it doesn't take away pressure. But pressure can be quite painful. So I actually started to feel this pressure pain. After another 4 hours, I was checked and I was at 9.5 centimetres. So really close to 10 centimetres, but not quite there. And I was getting a little bit nervous actually, because I'd gotten really well with the midwife that I had, and I knew that their shift was coming to an end and it was going to swap, and I really wanted to like give birth with those midwives because I'd built up like a rapport with them and a trust with them, and I suddenly felt under pressure, and I was really disappointed to only be at 9.5 centimetres, and then I knew that it wasn't going to happen. So anyway, they didn't leave it another 4 hours, I guess, because I was at 9.5. So I don't think it was too long. It was maybe an hour, and they checked again, and I was at 10. And at this point, they give you an hour for descent. So this is for the baby to descend. So you don't do anything, you just sit there for an hour basically. And I was still having to use the gas and air. I was finding the contractions and the descent period quite intense, even with the epidural. And then they told me that for pushing, I couldn't have the gas and air. And I felt like that sent me into a bit of a spiral. Like, how am I going to cope with pushing without the gas and air when I'm needing it now? And yeah, it sent me into a bit of a spiral of anxiety, and everything changed at this point for me sort of mentally. Johnny later said it was like I had just realised I was going to have a baby. For me, it was more that I realised I was going to have a baby without the gas and air, and I didn't think I could do it. And my midwives changed, and honestly that did throw me as well. I think it's a real shame that happened. So my midwives left, and it was the first time I had a one midwife as well. She came in, and I was in this sort of state of shock, and honestly I was barely talking to anyone. I was just in my own head thinking, I cannot do this, I cannot do this. I remember, like Johnny was saying, you're going to be fine. This midwife was saying, you know, we're going to be fine, we're pushing soon, it's exciting, you're going to meet your baby soon. The doctors must have just changed. These three doctors came in to introduce themselves, and I don't think I said a word to them. I just remember staring at them, and they were saying, oh, you're going to be pushing soon, like it's exciting. And I was just like, you're mad. Like, how am I going to get this baby out? How am I going to push this baby out? You're all mad. And I know it sounds weird to say, but I actually think this state of shock and feeling of I can't do it is very common. So all of that was going on during this hour, and then it got to pushing. And I have to say, the pushing was not as hard as I thought it was going to be. Like, without the gas in it, I was fine. I even didn't reach for it in between the pushing. The reason they say you can't have it is because they say you sort of can't have it and push, because you sort of taking a big breath of air and hold it and push. They said that you couldn't do that with the gas and air. But I was okay pushing. After 2 hours of pushing, he wasn't coming out. So yeah, 2 hours had gone by. I'd tried a few positions. I'd managed to get up on my knees, sort of holding onto the bed backwards, because that's supposed to be a good position for pushing. And with the epidural, I never lost the feeling of my legs. So I never got up and walked around, but I could move them and I could get onto my knees. So again, even with the epidural, I could feel him moving, but he wasn't coming out, or he hadn't come out after 2 hours, and that's how long they sort of let you push for. So at this point, a doctor came in, and it was the same one who had admitted me. So that's how long, like, she'd finished her shift, gone home, and come back on shift, and I was still in labour. So she did an examination. Honestly, that was really not pleasant. It was really painful, and I remember in my head thinking, like, stop, stop, stop. I don't know if I actually said stop, 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 but I was definitely saying, like, this really hurts, this really hurts. And I asked Johnny about it afterwards, because I felt a little bit traumatised by this examination. And he said, yeah, she just sort of acted as though she had a job and she was there to do it, and she was just going to do it. So that was his take on it. So I feel like my take was actually the same. Then this doctor turned to the midwife and said, we're going to theatre, it's a big baby. Obviously, that sent me into a bit of a panic. At this point, I think the anaesthetist came in as well to talk to me, and I was crying hysterically. I was, obviously exhausted, absolutely exhausted, starved, and just really scared, terrified. And I begged and begged for a cesarean, but I was told that, Luca was in the right position. He was really low down. They said he was too low. They'd have to push him back up for a cesarean, and that I needed to have a forceps delivery in the theatre. And that genuinely did terrify me, and I was crying for a long time before I agreed to it. Honestly, the whole sort of transition from delivery room to theatre is a bit of a blur. I know that I was wheeled through. Johnny was put in scrubs. I was taken into theatre, and I remember being asked if I could move from my bed onto the theatre bed, or if I wanted to be sort of pulled, and I just said pull me. And yeah, it's not glamorous at all, a forceps delivery. So my legs were up in stirrups. I was in this brightly lit room, loads of people, because they sort of prepare for any eventuality. So there's a lot of people there for you and for the baby in case you need extra medical attention. It felt like quite a while before the delivery started. Obviously, I was told that I needed an episiotomy for the forceps, which is a cut. I just kept saying to the anaesthetist, I want to be as numb as a cesarean. Like, do you promise I'll be as numb as a cesarean? He kept saying yes. And I think I had quite a high tolerance for the pain medication, because, as I say, throughout labour I could still feel my contractions, and I could feel the pressure, pain. and he seemed to need to give me a lot and seemed very surprised when I could still feel things, and he just kept putting more and more in. And even Johnny said he was really surprised at how many sort of syringes of medication he put into like my epidural. Actually using gas and air as well, and that was more for my mind and my anxiety. I kind of wanted to be out of it for this. So in terms of the episiotomy, for anyone who's nervous, I've seen people ask, like, can you hear it? Which is such a gruesome question. I did not hear it and I did not feel it. But the forceps delivery wasn't pleasant. I honestly still feel traumatized by it. So basically, you push and they pull, and it felt quite brutal. With each pull, I was being pulled down a bed and then being pulled back up to do the next round. I ended up having 4 rounds of pushing, and pushing about 3 times around with the forceps pulling before Luca was born. He was born, he was fine. He did have marks on both cheeks where the forceps were, but they were gone within a few days. He had a slight scratch on his head, which, to be honest, he still has a little scar, but it's nothing. I was sort of asking, like, was he okay? Was I okay? Had I torn? I wasn't really getting any answers for a long time, and it was really weird because I was aware, like, Luca was put on my chest, but I was just so out of it. And when I look at the pictures, I can just see how out of it I was. Luca was put on my chest, and he was taken away. Johnny cut the cord, and he was weighed, and I was aware of it in the background. I couldn't see any of it, and I couldn't be involved in any of it. And then Johnny disappeared, and Luca was crying in a sort of cot thing in the corner, and I was just being stitched. And I was told that I'd had a 2nd degree tear as well as the episiotomy. So I was stitched up in theatre and then wheeled through to recovery. Recovery is like a little room where I think there's maybe 3 bays, and at that point I got to properly see Luca, but at the same time you don't get any private time. So the midwife was checking everything. The sort of anaesthetist was also checking like where the epidural was, and they spray this cold spray to check where the epidural is and where your numbness is. And they were really shocked when they sprayed it, and I jumped at how low I could feel. So I do maintain that I think I had quite a high threshold for the pain medication, because to be honest, I don't recall the epidural being taken out of my back, but it obviously was. The midwife helps you sort of change clothes, like literally put pads in my knickers, put my knickers on for me, changed my top, brought toast and a drink, and we were there maybe a couple of hours. They said it was time to be wheeled through to the postnatal ward, and at this point Johnny had to leave because of COVID. They weren't letting partners like stay, and that was really awful. I'd had 3 days of labour, pretty much, no sleep, no food, and then a delivery which I found really traumatic. And then I had to say bye to my partner in the corridor while I was being wheeled to the postnatal recovery ward. That was really hard for me, really, really hard, and it's something that I don't really agree with in terms of the COVID restrictions. So basically the end of my birth story is that I was wheeled to the postnatal ward. It was 5 a.m. I sort of got left in there, I guess, like after they'd finished doing all their checks and things. And I just remember sitting there, and I had Luca next to me, and I was exhausted and just still felt in shock. And I had this newborn baby, and I was just alone. Like, all the lights were off because it was the middle of the night, and I just remember being in shock. It's the only word I can use to describe it. Like, there was 2-hour visiting slots for partners, and mine was supposed to be 2 p.m. like that afternoon, and I just said, can my partner come sooner than that? Like, I just couldn't even imagine being alone with this little baby after what I'd just been through for that long. And I just almost felt like I needed him there just to give me a cuddle. Like, we hadn't even been alone. I hadn't processed what had happened. So they said he could come at 10. So I remember like looking, messaging him, telling him he could come at 10, thinking I've just got 5 hours to get through. And then, you know, he's back here. That is the end of my birth. I really, really hope that this has been helpful. I know that like there's a lot of detail. It's been hugely personal for me to share this, but I am sharing it because I really don't want anyone to be blindsided by what happens. All the things that happened in my birth are really common. None of them are particularly complicated. It doesn't mean it's not difficult for someone who doesn't go through this every day. For someone who's going through this for the first time, it's a lot. So yeah, that was my experience. Thank you for watching. Please message me if you have any questions or concerns, and I promise I'll reply. I'll be there. I just really hope that this has been a positive video in terms of helping you to prepare for any kind of eventuality in birth.